Before we get to the drama that is the Chris Paul trade to the Clippers and his time in LA, we should talk for a second about what was going on in the league between the players and the owners in that time period. In 2006, right around the time Chris Paul is turning around this New Orleans team, a bunch of small market owners get together and write a letter to David Stern complaining that the league is too tilted to big market teams like the Lakers. This would be the seeds of the 2011 lockout when the owners canceled the beginnings of the seasons in order to extract money from the players. At the time, David Stern will say this is about competitive balance, but that was really a lot of crap. Actually, the years before 2011 were really good for competitive balance. You had some small market teams like San Antonio, debatably small market, but also Cleveland and Orlando making the finals. You had deep runs by the Phoenix Suns. You even had that New Orleans team that we just talked about, led by Chris Paul. So you had successful small market teams. What they were really worried about was profitability. And they wanted to get that money back from the players. So they lock out the players and try to demand a hard salary cap and concessions from the players. They actually get some big wins, the owners do, but there are disputes between the owners while negotiations are going on, specifically between small market teams and the owners of the Lakers and Knicks, who seem willing to compromise with the players. The other thing going on is the beginnings of the star empowerment era that's happening in the 2010-2011 period, and one of the guys at the center of all that is Chris Paul. I believe there was something at Carmelo Anthony's wedding, right?
Yeah, there was a toast that they were both going to go to the Knicks.
They were both going to go to the Knicks or something. This is right after the decision, so there's this idea that there's going to be a counter big three of Paul, Carmelo, and I guess Amari would be the third, and they're all going to be on the Knicks, and that's going to be the counterbalance to the Heat. And that's that idea is out there, and Paul clearly wants to go to New York or Los Angeles, and he's not going to resign in New Orleans. And at the same time, New Orleans is being sold. Their owner sells the team to the NBA as a placeholder until they can find a new owner, because this is right after the financial crisis and all the rich people are cash poor at the moment. So they got to wait for the stock market to rebound so they can buy things like NBA teams. And so the NBA is officially the owner of the Hornets, but they're letting the team be run by the GM. There's an agreed trade to send Chris Paul to the Lakers. That would have, I think, sent Odom and a few other players and pieces to New Orleans and Paul to the Lakers. This trade is agreed upon by both parties, and then David Stern, the NBA commissioner, overrules it. He says, nah. Instead, a couple weeks later or days later, he's sent to the Clippers, the other Los Angeles team, and for a clearly worse package. The return that New Orleans gets is not as good as what they're not getting a player like Odom. I think the best player was Al Farouk Aminu or something.
It was Eric Gordon or
something so they're not getting that much back. I think they got draft picks, but I think the draft pick turned into Austin Rivers or something like that. It wasn't a particularly good haul for a player of Chris Paul's caliber, but it pairs Paul with Blake Griffin, who was the reigning Rookie of the Year at the time, and is this exciting young player for the Clippers. The pairing of them really reanimates, I shouldn't even say reanimates, it animates the Clippers, who for the first time basically ever are now suddenly a relevant team and will have multiple deep postseason runs with Paul and Blake Griffin. And the killing of that trade is one of David Stern's last acts as the NBA commissioner, and one of the most controversial. It leads to all kinds of conspiracy theories.
Yeah, is it even really conspiracy theory? It's the Dan Gilbert letter that he sent to David Stern, once the trade was proposed, is public record,
That's true. So we want to talk about the Dan Gilbert letter?
Yeah, basically Dan Gilbert, who is owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, he's the one who published a letter after LeBron James left the Cavs that was we didn't want him anyway,
So this is Dan Gilbert's second most famous letter that we're about to talk about. But yeah.
He's basically saying, he basically encourages David Stern to prevent the trade from going through. He says that it should be decided by what he calls the 29 owners of the New Orleans Hornets, of which he is one. Those are the other owners in the league, and he's he has all these complaints about the trade. He's you're letting the Lakers both shed salary and get Chris Paul, he says in it very famously, it's like, when will we just change the name of 25 of the 30 teams to the Washington Generals? And shortly after this email is when David Stern puts the kibosh on the trade.
Right. So it's clearly, I guess what I mean, it's a conspiracy theory, is that Stern says that if the Hornets are going to get sold, they can't trade their best player. Like, Paul is too valuable, and like he will make the Hornets less valuable in a sale if he's traded. But then they traded him like a week later to the Clippers and got less in return. So obviously that's fucking bullshit. And like really what he was doing was he was acting on behalf of the owners, who still had residual anger at the Lakers for not holding firm with the other small market teams and kind of playing footsie with the union during those 2011 negotiations. This trade is literally days after the lockout ends, and the owners who really won the lockout still want to punish the Lakers for even just showing a hint of dissent. And Paul's career gets all caught up in this, and then he ends up getting traded to the Clippers.
Yeah, so just to talk about his reign in the Clippers, his time with the Clippers a little bit. Most people remember that for the famous playoff disappointments. So I think you said that the Clippers made some deep playoff runs in those years. They were famously not that deep because they never made the conference finals. The Clippers' first franchise conference finals appearance is this year. And it's ironic that they're playing Chris Paul. There were some like all-time playoff meltdowns. In 2014, people remember the Donald Sterling fiasco, where the league sort of intervened. First the racist comments about Magic Johnson, and many people came to light, and Donald Sterling was the owner of the Clippers and was sort of forced out, and there were rumors of player protests before the league stepped in and removed him and forced him to sell the team. But the story that gets remembered in the zeitgeist is like the Clippers had to deal with all that, and it kind of sapped their energy for this playoff run. But the series after that was when they play the Thunder, and in Game 5, it was like the pivotal game in that series. In the last minute of Game 5, the Clippers blow a 7-point lead. In the last 30 seconds, Paul, when the Clippers are up 2, gets stripped by Russell Westbrook. Then on the other end, he fouls Russell Westbrook shooting a 3. Russell Westbrook makes all his 3 free throws. Then Chris Paul gets like one chance to try to hit a game-winning shot right before the buzzer, but he dribbles the final possession off of his foot. Just not what you want. It was at the time like very embarrassing, and Jared Dudley, who was on that Clippers team, says that like after that series, after they blew that to the Thunder when they had a real chance to advance, he kind of knew that the Clippers were done and like we're never going to make a deeper run.
Yeah, I mean, I think that his run with the Clippers is really marked as like an almost like would-have and could-haves and should-haves, right? It's a period of a team that they never reached the conference finals. They never were all healthy at the same time. They never really had a clear window, and at a certain point it just sort of falls apart. But it's also the period where Paul becomes union president, which is what really makes him a fascinating person from a labor perspective.
Yeah. So he takes over the union in 2013. So the NBPA has like an interesting history. So it was organized in 1954. The union push was led by Bob Cousy, who's like one of the most legendary and prestigious players in NBA history, and it was sort of formed by the top players. And in its early history, like some of the most notable leaders were Bob Cousy and Oscar Robertson, who were both presidents of the union. And the union succeeded when its stars used their leverage. And for a while, that worked for the union. But then in the 90s, a lot of the stars grew disillusioned with the union. The sort of dynamic got exacerbated after 1998 when there was a lockout. Basically, David Stern, who was the commissioner of basketball for like 40 years, he made a deliberate effort to like create a firm division between the star players and the the rank and file in the NBA Players Union. And so his strategy during that lockout was he offered to raise the minimum salary floor in exchange for the max salary, for capping the high end of what players could earn. And
just for a little of context here, I think it's important, is that this is in the period where the lockout is really triggered in the 90s by what owners feel is excessive star salaries. I mean, the big one famously was Kevin Garnett's huge contract with the Minnesota Timberwolves, that I think at the time was a record for the biggest contract. He signs this like something in his first or second year. Remember, Garnett is the first guy to go from high school to the NBA, and then within a year he signs a $126 million contract with Minnesota, and the owner's like, this is crazy, we have to cap these huge salaries, or sort of to get this concession of a cap on these high salaries, they are offered to raise the salaries of lower of the floor, the minimums, basically.
Yeah, so then for the next 12 years, the union kind of flounders a little bit. You know, the Stars see that their interests sort of like flowing away from the interests of the union. And then in 2011, there's a lockout again, and the league is able to basically negotiate down the BRI ratio that the players get. So BRI stands for basketball related income, and it's basically the share of the pie that the players get. So, it had been that the players got like 55% of the pie.
I think it was 57.
57. But in 2011, the players had to accept 50-50. And so Chris Paul takes over in 2013.
I want to pause for a second, because I think it's important to take a step back and really like emphasize like what is happening right at this moment, which is when Chris Paul becomes the president of the union in 2013, he's replacing Derek Fisher. It's, as you point out, like as the Stars are drifting away from the union, which historically had been sort of a star powered organization in the NBA, it's run by guys like Derek Fisher and other role players. And there's a perception, perhaps unfairly, that Fisher, during the lockout, was more concerned with restarting the season and ensuring that role players like himself would get paychecks than with securing the best possible deals. There were some reports that were later disputed, so you should take them with a grain of salt, but there were some reports that Fisher had private meetings with David Stern agreeing to the 50-50 split at a time when the executive director of the union, Billy Hunter, was trying to hold firm at 53. Again, some disputed reporting there, but there is some general sense of dissatisfaction with Fisher. Chris Paul takes over the union in 2013, so all of a sudden the power in the union shifts back to the Stars, and it's seen as, okay, now the union is looking out for star players, and Chris Paul is a much different type of player than Derek Fisher.
And I should have noted earlier, when Chris Paul takes over the union as president, I shouldn't say take over, there are a lot of people in the union, but when Chris Paul becomes president of the union, he brings his friends with him.
Yes.
So he's famously like very close with LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony, who both become vice presidents of the union. So yeah, I mean, you are seeing an increased commitment to the union from these star guys.